April the 8th, 1943. 27,000 feet above the skies near Kongsberg, the air is thin and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps through flight suits and settles in a bone. A German pilot named Oberleutnant Franz Hoflinger banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a wide arc, squinting through his canopy at a formation of American bombers below, and beside them, a shape he has never encountered in combat before. It is bulky. It is heavy. It looks nothing like the lean, wolf-like fighters his own Luftwaffe has built its legend upon. To Hoflinger, and to the men flying beside him that morning, the aircraft below looks less like a weapon of war and more like a mistake, a swollen, barrel-shaped intruder that seems too large, too clumsy, too slow to survive in the skies over occupied Europe. Radio chatter crackles between German cockpits, and someone laughs, calling it a flying milk bottle, the kind of insult that spreads fast among fighter pilots hungry for something to mock. What none of them could have known in that freezing moment above Kongsberg is that the aircraft they were laughing at carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, a combined rate of fire that could put more than 100 rounds into a target every single second. What none of them could have known is that within minutes, the milk bottle would turn and speak. Before the Thunderbolt ever crossed the English Channel, before it ever silenced a single German pilot's laughter, it was a design born out of desperation, compromise, and a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations that everyone else in military aviation had already accepted as fact. In the spring of 1940, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant engineer working for Republic Aviation on Long Island, faced a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. The United States Army Air Corps needed a fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers deep into enemy territory, a fighter that could survive punishing combat at high altitude, absorb enormous battle damage, and still bring its pilot home. Every existing design philosophy pointed towards smaller, lighter, more maneuverable aircraft, the kind the Germans and the Japanese had already perfected. Kartveli built the opposite. He designed a fighter around the largest and most powerful piston engine available in America. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower, more power than most World War I bomber formations combined possessed collectively just 2 decades earlier. The result was an aircraft that tipped the scales at over 7 tons fully loaded, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter to see combat in the entire war, a statistic that other nations viewed with open contempt. American engineers understood something that European designers did not fully appreciate in 1940, and that understanding would define the entire Pacific and European air war within 3 years. Weight, when paired with sufficient power, was not a weakness. It was a form of protection. The heavier the airframe, the more punishment it could absorb before catastrophic failure, and the faster it could dive away from lighter, more fragile opponents. Every rivet, every panel, every design decision Kartveli made was rooted in a singular philosophy. The aircraft existed to bring the man inside at home alive, even if that meant sacrificing the elegance and agility that fighter pilots traditionally craved. The prototype, designated the XP-47B, took its first flight on May 6, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor would drag America fully into a war already consuming Europe. Test pilots described the aircraft using words that would follow it for its entire service life. Words like massive, heavy, and unwieldy. It did not handle like a fighter. It handled like something closer to a flying tank, and in the fighter pilot culture of the early 1940s, that comparison was not meant as a compliment. By the time the P-47 Thunderbolt reached operational squadrons in England in early 1943, skepticism ran deep, and not only among the Germans who would soon encounter it in combat. American bomber crews eyed it with suspicion. Fellow fighter pilots flying the sleek, twin-engine P-38 Lightning openly questioned whether something so large and cumbersome could survive dogfights against the Luftwaffe's battle-hardened aces, men who had spent 3 years perfecting aerial combat over Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. The Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York had already committed to producing thousands of these aircraft, an enormous industrial gamble on a design many considered obsolete before it ever fired a shot in anger. Somewhere in that gamble, though, lay a truth the skeptics could not yet see. The same weight that made the Thunderbolt look ridiculous on paper would make it nearly impossible to kill in the sky, and the same size that fighter pilots mocked would soon carry enough firepower and fuel to escort bombers farther into enemy territory than any American fighter before it. The milk bottle was about to enter a war that would prove decisively, brutally, and repeatedly just how wrong first impressions could be. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in December 1942, assigned to the 4th Fighter Group, a unit built from the ashes of the Eagle squadrons, American volunteers who had flown for the Royal Air Force before the United States even entered the war. These pilots had cut their teeth in Spitfires, nimble, responsive aircraft that rewarded finesse and punished heaviness, and many of them regarded their new mount with something close to betrayal. Colonel Don Blakesley, one of the most respected fighter leaders in the European theater, reportedly complained that the Thunderbolt could not even climb away from a German fighter, let alone outmaneuver one. The complaints were not unfounded. At low altitude, below 15,000 feet, the P-47 handled sluggishly compared to the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, both of which could outturn and outclimb the American newcomer with apparent ease. What the pilots training in the cold skies over East Anglia did not yet fully grasp was that the Thunderbolt had never been designed to fight at low altitude in the first place. Its turbo-supercharger, buried in the rear fuselage and connected to the engine by an intricate network of ducting, was engineered to maintain full power output at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, an environment where German fighters, dependent on simpler mechanical supercharging, began to lose their performance edge dramatically. The Thunderbolt's first combat mission came on April 8, 1943, a fighter sweep over the French coast that produced no confirmed kills but proved the aircraft could survive contact with the enemy without falling apart. 2 weeks later, on April 15th, Major Don Blakesley's squadron mate, Major Eugene Roberts, secured the type's first confirmed aerial victory, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 near Knock, Belgium. The kill validated something the skeptics had refused to consider, that the very qualities making the Thunderbolt feel clumsy at low altitude transformed it into a genuine predator once German fighters attempted to escape by diving away, a maneuver that had worked flawlessly against every previous American fighter. The P-47 could outdive virtually anything in the sky, a direct consequence of its enormous weight and robust airframe. And German pilots who had spent years relying on the dive as their preferred escape tactic suddenly found themselves being chased down by 7 tons of American steel, closing the distance at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from this early period reveal a subtle shift in tone, moving from outright dismissal toward a grudging acknowledgement that this new American fighter behaved unpredictably, refusing to conform to the tactical assumptions that had governed European air combat since 1939. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had committed several fighter groups entirely to the Thunderbolt, and the statistics beginning to accumulate told a story the early skeptics could not ignore. Each aircraft carried 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, mounted in each wing, feeding from ammunition boxes that together held up to 3,400 rounds, an almost absurd quantity of firepower for a single-seat fighter. When a Thunderbolt pilot opened fire at close range, the combined weight of lead striking an enemy aircraft could tear through engine blocks, sever control cables, and shatter airframes in less time than it took to draw breath. German pilots who survived encounters with the P-47 began reporting damage patterns unlike anything they had previously documented, aircraft returning to base, when they returned at all, with wings nearly severed from fuselages and cockpits perforated beyond recognition. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated in the summer of 1943, described the experience of being caught in a Thunderbolt's gun sight with a single unsettling sentence, stating that it felt as though the sky itself had turned into a wall of metal. The mockery of the flying milk bottle had not disappeared entirely from Luftwaffe radio chatter. but it had begun to carry a different weight, the uneasy humor of men trying to convince themselves that what they had witnessed in combat was somehow less dangerous than it appeared. What none of the German pilots monitoring these early engagements fully understood was that the Thunderbolt's combat debut represented only a fraction of its intended purpose. The aircraft's true strategic value would not become apparent until American commanders solved a problem that had haunted the entire bombing campaign since its inception. The brutal reality that unescorted bombers flying deep into Germany suffered catastrophic losses once their fighter escorts were forced to turn back at the limits of their fuel range. The Thunderbolt, heavy and seemingly ungainly, possessed something none of its lighter, more elegant rivals could match: enough internal fuel capacity and structural strength to eventually carry external drop tanks that would extend its reach far beyond anything German air defense planners had prepared for. That transformation was still months away in the spring of 1943, but the pieces were already falling into place, and German Fighter Command, still dismissing the milk bottle in their pilot briefings, had no idea what was coming. Among the pilots who came to define the Thunderbolt's reputation, few names carry the weight of Captain Robert S. Johnson, a 23-year-old former Oklahoma farm boy assigned to the 56 Fighter Group, a unit that would eventually become the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater. Johnson's story begins not with a triumphant kill, but with a mission on June 26, 1943, that nearly ended his life and, in doing so, became one of the most remarkable testaments to the Thunderbolt's survivability ever recorded. Flying escort over France that afternoon, Johnson's formation was ambushed by a group of Focke-Wulf 190s diving from higher altitude, a classic hit-and-run tactic the Luftwaffe had perfected over years of combat. Cannon fire tore through Johnson's aircraft almost immediately, shattering his canopy, wounding him in the hand and thigh, and severing his oxygen and hydraulic lines. Smoke filled the cockpit. Flames licked at the edges of the instrument panel. By every reasonable expectation of 1943 aerial combat, Robert Johnson should have died in that cockpit, either from the initial damage or from the German fighter pilot who spotted his crippled aircraft and moved in for what should have been an easy kill. What happened next became legend among the pilots of the 56 Fighter Group. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unidentified but clearly skilled German pilot, closed a point-blank range behind Johnson's smoking, barely controllable Thunderbolt, and opened fire with everything his aircraft carried: cannon shells, a machine gun, rounds tearing into the fuselage from a distance, so close that Johnson could see the German pilot's face through his own shattered canopy. The attack continued for what felt like an eternity, round after round striking the Thunderbolt's rear, fuselage, and tail section, and still the aircraft refused to break apart in the sky. Johnson later counted more than 200 bullet and shrapnel holes across his airframe, damage that would have brought down virtually any other fighter flying in that war, whether German, British, or Japanese. The German pilot eventually exhausted his ammunition, and in a moment that has been retold in countless accounts of the air war, pulled alongside the crippled American fighter, looked directly at Johnson through the canopy glass, and simply flew away, apparently astonished that the aircraft was still airborne at all. Robert Johnson nursed his shattered Thunderbolt back across the English Channel and landed safely at his home base, an outcome that seemed almost mathematically impossible given the extent of the damage. The story of Johnson's survival spread quickly through Fighter Command, and it did more to change perceptions of the Thunderbolt than any statistic or engineering report could have accomplished. Ground crews who inspected his aircraft afterward described disbelief bordering on reverence, noting that the rugged construction of the fuselage, the redundant control systems, and the sheer structural mass of the airframe had absorbed damage that should have proven fatal many times over. Robert Johnson would go on to become one of the top American aces of the European theater, eventually credited with 27 confirmed aerial victories, and he attributed his survival, and by extension his entire combat record, directly to the aircraft that so many pilots had once dismissed as too heavy and too clumsy to succeed. What had begun as a mocking nickname among Luftwaffe pilots was beginning to take on an entirely different meaning among the Americans who flew the Thunderbolt into combat day after day. A growing understanding that the very weight and bulk once ridiculed had become the single greatest reason so many young pilots were returning home to their families instead of becoming names on a casualty list. By late 1943, word of incidents like Johnson's survival had begun circulating even among German fighter units, creating a strange and unsettling psychological effect that would only intensify as the war progressed. German pilots accustomed to watching enemy aircraft disintegrate under sustained cannon fire now found themselves facing a fighter that seemed to defy the basic mathematics of aerial combat, absorbing damage that should have been lethal and continuing to fly, continuing to fight, and continuing to bring its pilot home. The mockery had not entirely vanished from Luftwaffe briefing rooms, but a quieter, more troubling question had begun to take its place among veteran pilots who had encountered the Thunderbolt in combat and survived to describe it. If 850 caliber machine guns and pilots half their age in an aircraft they had once dismissed as a flying milk bottle could survive encounters that should have been fatal, what exactly would happen when the Americans finally solved the range problem and brought this aircraft deep into the heart of the Reich itself? Throughout the summer and fall of 1943, American bomber crews paid an unbearable price for a strategic limitation that no amount of courage could overcome: the simple mechanical reality that fighter escorts, including the increasingly respected Thunderbolt, lacked the fuel range to accompany heavy bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. Missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943 demonstrated this vulnerability with horrifying clarity, as B-17 flying fortresses, stripped of fighter protection once they crossed beyond the Thunderbolt's operational range, absorbed catastrophic losses to German fighters waiting patiently for the escort to turn back toward England. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers on the Schweinfurt raid alone, roughly 600 young American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon, a loss rate so severe that some historians consider it the moment American air commanders finally accepted that escort range was not a tactical inconvenience, but an existential crisis threatening the entire strategic bombing campaign. Republic aviation engineers, working alongside the Army Air Forces, had already begun testing solutions to this problem, and by early 1944, the answer arrived in the form of external fuel tanks mounted beneath the Thunderbolt's fuselage and wings, extending its combat radius from roughly 200 miles to well over 400 miles, a transformation that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in European skies. The introduction of these extended-range Thunderbolts coincided with a broader industrial reality that German commanders, for all their tactical brilliance, could never fully counter. American factories, led by Republic's massive production facility in Farmingdale, New York, alongside a second plant in Evansville, Indiana, were manufacturing P-47s at a pace that dwarfed anything German industry could match. By the war's end, American factories had produced over 15,600 Thunderbolts, a staggering figure when compared against Germany's entire fighter production for the same period, and every single one of those aircraft represented another set of 850 caliber machine guns, another 2,000 horsepower engine, and another young pilot trained through an American flight program that, by 1944, was graduating pilots with over 400 hours of flight training, compared to German pilot training programs that had been forced by fuel shortages and mounting losses to reduce training time to as little as 100 hours or less. The mathematics of attrition had begun to shift decisively, and no amount of individual skill or bravery among German pilots could indefinitely offset an enemy capable of replacing every lost aircraft and pilot several times over. With extended range and growing numbers, Thunderbolt pilots began ranging deeper into occupied Europe than ever before, and their mission profile expanded beyond pure bomber escort into something German ground forces would come to fear almost as much as their pilots feared the aircraft in the air. Thunderbolt pilots discovered, almost by accident during return flights from escort missions, that their aircraft's ruggedness and firepower made it devastatingly effective in the low-altitude ground attack role, strafing German trains, trucks, and airfields with the same 8 machine guns that had proven so lethal in aerial combat. German soldiers began referring to the aircraft using their own nickname, one that carried none of the mockery embedded in the earlier flying milk bottle insult, calling it simply Jabo, short for jag bomber or fighter bomber, a term spoken with genuine dread among troops who had learned to scan the sky constantly for the telltale silhouette of an approaching Thunderbolt. Reports from German rail transport officials in 1944 documented Thunderbolt attacks, destroying locomotives with such regularity that entire supply routes were rerouted or abandoned during daylight hours, a strategic consequence that extended far beyond the aerial combat statistics most historians focus upon. By the spring of 1944, the aircraft that German pilots had once laughed at over the skies of Kongsberg had become something entirely different. An instrument capable of projecting American industrial and technological power hundreds of miles beyond where it had first proven itself capable of survival. The extended-range Thunderbolts, soon to be joined and eventually partially replaced in the pure escort role by the P-51 Mustang, had already accomplished something crucial, demonstrating that American engineering philosophy, built around weight, power, and survivability rather than elegance and finesse, could adapt and evolve to meet whatever challenge the war presented. German intelligence officers compiling reports on American fighter capabilities throughout 1944 increasingly used a different vocabulary than they had in 1943, one that had shed the earlier condescension entirely, replaced instead by a grim, professional respect for an aircraft that refused to conform to their expectations at every turn. And that question, quietly circulating through Luftwaffe command by the summer of 1944, had grown considerably darker and considerably more urgent. June 6, 1944 arrived with a scale of aerial commitment that no German air defense planner could have adequately prepared for, as thousands of Allied aircraft filled the skies above the beaches of Normandy, providing cover for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Thunderbolt squadrons flew mission after mission that day and in the weeks that followed, and their role extended far beyond the aerial combat that had defined their reputation over the previous year. German armor columns attempting to reinforce the crumbling coastal defenses found themselves exposed on open roads during daylight hours, easy prey for Thunderbolt pilots who had, by this point in the war, refined ground attack tactics into something approaching a science. The 850 caliber machine guns that had proven so devastating against enemy aircraft now tore through the lightly armored tops and sides of German half-tracks, fuel trucks, and troop transports with equally lethal effect, and Thunderbolt pilots began carrying bombs and rockets in addition to their formidable gun armament, transforming the aircraft into what amounted to a flying artillery piece capable of striking with precision at a moment's notice. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 became perhaps the starkest demonstration yet of what German commanders had feared since the extended-range Thunderbolts first began appearing over their supply lines. As retreating German forces attempted to escape encirclement through a narrow corridor near the town of Falaise, Allied fighter bombers, Thunderbolts prominent among them, descended upon the congested roads in overwhelming numbers, destroying an almost incomprehensible quantity of German vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces in a matter of days. German general officers who survived the pocket later described the experience in terms that echoed, and in some cases exceeded, the fear expressed by Luftwaffe pilots a year earlier. One senior German officer, interrogated after his capture, reportedly stated that his men had stopped looking to the sky entirely during daylight hours, having concluded that any movement, any convoy, any concentration of vehicles would inevitably draw the attention of American fighter bombers circling overhead, hunting for exactly the kind of targets that German logistics depended upon to sustain the war effort. Robert Johnson, the Oklahoma farm boy who had once nursed a shattered Thunderbolt home after absorbing over 200 rounds of German cannon fire, continued flying combat missions throughout this period, adding steadily to his growing tally of aerial victories, while also participating in the ground attack missions that had become central to the Thunderbolt's wartime legacy. By the time Johnson completed his combat tour and returned to the United States in 1944, he had accumulated 27 confirmed aerial victories, a record that placed him among the elite fighter pilots of the entire European theater, and he consistently credited the aircraft itself, its ruggedness, its firepower, and its ability to survive damage that would have destroyed any other fighter of the era, as the single greatest factor separating his survival from the fate suffered by countless other young pilots on both sides of the conflict. His story, once a remarkable anomaly discussed in hushed tones among fellow pilots, had by 1944 become something closer to expected performance, a demonstration of exactly what American engineers had intended when they built an aircraft prioritizing survivability above elegance. By the final months of 1944, German military reports had abandoned any pretense of the earlier mockery entirely, and the aircraft once dismissed as a flying milk bottle had become, in the assessment of German commanders desperately trying to preserve what remained of their fighting capability, one of the primary instruments responsible for the systematic destruction of German mobility across the entire Western Front. The transformation from ridiculed newcomer to feared instrument of destruction had taken less than 18 months, a timeline that reflected not just the evolving tactics of American pilots, but the deeper industrial and technological reality underlying the entire conflict, a reality German commanders had begun to understand far too late to change the outcome that was now rapidly approaching. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into the collapsing remnants of the Third Reich, the statistics surrounding the P-47 Thunderbolt had accumulated into a record so overwhelming that even the aircraft's harshest early critics within the Luftwaffe could no longer deny its place among the most effective weapons of the entire war. American factories had produced over 15,600 Thunderbolts by the time production ceased, and these aircraft had flown more than 540,000 combat sorties across every major theater of the European air war, destroying an estimated 9,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, while claiming credit for the destruction of over 6,000 armored vehicles, 6,800 locomotives, and 86,000 rail cars, a campaign of industrial destruction that had systematically strangled Germany's ability to move troops, fuel, and supplies across a collapsing front. Perhaps most remarkably, despite flying in the most dangerous low-altitude ground attack missions of the war, the Thunderbolt maintained one of the lowest loss rates per sortie of any Allied fighter, a statistic that traced directly back to the very design philosophy that German pilots had once mocked over the skies of France, the sheer bulk, redundancy, and structural toughness that had turned Alexander Kartvel's radial engine giant into the most survivable single-seat fighter of the Second World War. Robert Johnson, having returned home from his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories and a body that carried the physical reminders of that June afternoon in 1943, lived to see his aircraft's reputation transformed entirely from object of ridicule to symbol of American engineering triumph. In post-war interviews and writings, Johnson never wavered from the conviction he had formed in the cockpit of his smoking, bullet-riddled Thunderbolt over occupied France, that the aircraft's weight, dismissed by German pilots as clumsy excess, had in fact been the single decision that separated his survival from the fate of so many young men who never came home. German pilots who survived the war and later spoke with American historians and veterans offered a strikingly consistent assessment of the aircraft, one senior Luftwaffe fighter commander reportedly admitting after the war that his pilots had learned to fear the Thunderbolt more than almost any other American aircraft, not because it outmaneuvered them in the classic sense, but because it simply refused to die, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf many times over while continuing to deliver devastating firepower until the very last moment of an engagement. The German pilot who had once dismissed these aircraft as flying milk bottles over the skies near Kongsberg in the earliest days of the Thunderbolt's combat service could never have imagined, in that moment of casual contempt, the reckoning that awaited his Luftwaffe in the years that followed. What had begun as a joke among veteran fighter pilots convinced that speed and agility alone determined victory in the sky had ended as a demonstration of a different kind of aerial warfare altogether, one built upon American industrial capacity, engineering philosophy centered on survivability, and the courage of young pilots like Robert Johnson, who flew that heavy, unglamorous aircraft in a combat day after day, and, more often than any reasonable expectation would have predicted, brought it home again. The mathematics of destruction that Alexander Kartveli and Republic Aviation's engineers had built into every rivet and reinforced panel of the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven, in the end, to be exactly the kind of overwhelming, unglamorous, and undeniable force that decided the outcome of the greatest air war in human history. And by the time the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the sky, quite simply, belonged to America.